The air in the executive lounge of Sterling Vane doesn't circulate. It's curated. It carries the faint, sterile scent of ionized oxygen and the kind of expensive sandalwood that only suggests itself to people who can afford to ignore the price of a candle. From the 42nd floor, the city looks like a high-resolution simulation, a grid of frantic ants convinced their movement matters. Up here, silence is the ultimate currency. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a leather-bound folio that contained the architectural soul of the Midtown Convergence Project. To the world, this was a multi-billion-dollar urban redevelopment. To the men sitting at the mahogany table behind me, it was a carcass to be stripped. "The coffee is cold, Elias." The voice belonged to Julian Thorne, managing partner, a man whose tan was as permanent as his disdain for anyone earning less than 7 figures. He didn't look up from his tablet. He didn't need to. He treated my presence in the room like a piece of high-end furniture, functional, silent, and entirely replaceable. I didn't turn around. I kept my gaze on the horizon. "I'll notify the steward, Julian." "Don't notify him, fix it," chimed Marcus. Marcus was the crown prince of the firm, a 34-year-old legacy hire who wore his insecurity in the form of an overly aggressive Windsor knot. They called it a senior fellowship. In reality, for the last 6 months, I had been their ghost. I was the one who stayed until 3 a.m. correcting their structural calculations. I was the one who found the $40 million leak in their offshore accounts that they'd been too lazy to notice. I was the free labor they bragged about over dry martinis, the brilliant mind they'd tricked into a non-equity, non-salaried consultancy under the promise of a partnership that was never going to materialize. They saw a desperate academic, a man with a PhD and a thin resume who needed their prestige to survive. They were half right. I did need them. I needed them exactly where I had them, overconfident and statistically blind. I walked over to the table. I didn't take the coffee. I didn't take the depositions. I simply laid the leather folio down in front of Julian. "The final audit for the judge's hearing tomorrow," I said. "Everything is prepared, every liability accounted for, every asset verified." Julian finally looked up, his eyes scanning me with the clinical boredom of a man looking at a bug. "Good. Now Marcus mentioned the coffee, and my car needs to be at the south entrance by 5, not the north, the south. Try to process that sequence correctly, will you?" I watched him. I watched the way his thumb rubbed the edge of his Patek Philippe, a nervous tic he only displayed when he was lying to himself about the stability of his firm. He thought he was the architect of this empire. He didn't realize he was just the tenant. "You've spent 300 hours on this audit, haven't you, Elias?" Marcus asked, leaning back, his feet nearly touching the mahogany. "Free of charge, the passion of the youth. It's truly inspiring. Most people would want a contract. You just want to be in the room." "Being in the room is often more valuable than the contract, Marcus." My voice was a flat line. No anger, no resentment, just the cold, hard fact of the matter. "Spoken like a man who's never had a bank account that mattered," sneered Julian. He flicked the folio toward the edge of the table, nearly sending the months of my life's work onto the floor. "Go. You're cluttering the aesthetic. We have the preparatory session with the Justice Department's liaison in 20 minutes. You aren't cleared for that level of adult conversation." I didn't move. I looked at the clock on the wall, a minimalist piece of art that ticked with the precision of a guillotine. "The judge is very particular about who provides the counsel for this merger," I said, my voice shifting just a fraction of a degree. "He doesn't like surprises. He likes transparency. He likes to know exactly who did the math." Julian let out a short, dry puff of air that might have been a laugh.
The judge? Justice Sterling is a personal friend of mine. We golf at the same club in the Hamptons. He doesn't care about the who, he cares about the what. And the what is that this firm is about to become the largest real estate conglomerate on the eastern seaboard. Actually, I adjusted my cuffs, the what is a matter of fiduciary interpretation. If the numbers in that folio are even slightly misaligned, the entire merger doesn't just stall, it implodes, and with it the personal indemnification of every partner in this room. Marcus stood up then, his face flushing a dull, angry red. Is that a threat? You're a glorified intern, Elias. You're a footnote. You have no standing, no contract, and no future outside of what we decide to give you. Now get out before I have security walk you to the curb like the trash you're starting to resemble. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fear behind the arrogance. I saw the $200 million in debt he'd hidden in the subfolders of the Convergence Project, thinking no one would look deep enough to find the labor costs he'd been skimming. I leave, I said, picking up the folio, but you might want to check your email. There was a filing at 8 a.m. this morning, a change in the hearings protocol. What filing? Julian snapped, reaching for his phone. The one where the court-appointed special master was named, I said, walking toward the heavy oak doors. I stopped at the door, my hand on the cool metal handle. I didn't look back. I'll see you in court, Julian. Try to wear a different tie. The one you have on, it looks like you're trying too hard to be important. I stepped out into the hallway, the silent, pressurized air of the 42nd floor finally feeling like it was beginning to vent. Behind me, I heard the frantic tapping of Julian's fingers on glass and the first faint cracks of a panic that was about to become a landslide.
The boardroom of the federal courthouse was a stark contrast to the glass and chrome vanity of Sterling and Vane. Here, the walls were paneled in heavy, dark oak that had absorbed a century of corporate lies and desperate pleas. There were no panoramic views, only the relentless, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that felt like a pulse. Julian and Marcus sat across from me, flanked by a phalanx of junior associates who looked like they hadn't slept since the previous quarter. Julian's tan looked sickly under the fluorescent lights, yellowed like old parchment. He was still trying to play the part of the Titan, leaning back with a forced, practiced ease, but his eyes were darting toward the empty seat at the head of the table. "This is a formality, Elias," Julian whispered, his voice vibrating with a suppressed rage that made the air around him feel jagged. "I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling with the protocol change, but once Justice Sterling walks through those doors, your little performance ends. You'll be lucky if you're allowed to practice law as a notary in a strip mall." Marcus didn't speak. He was staring at a printed email on his tablet, his thumb twitching rhythmically against the screen. I knew what he was looking at, the formal notification that the court had appointed a special master to oversee the dissolution of the Midtown Convergence merger. He just hadn't realized yet that the name on the appointment wasn't a stranger. The doors opened. Justice Arthur Sterling entered. He was 74, with a back as straight as a ledger line and a reputation for being the most expensive person in the world to lie to. He didn't offer handshakes. He didn't acknowledge the fawning smiles of the Sterling and Vane associates. He sat down, adjusted his spectacles, and opened a file that looked suspiciously like the one I'd been carrying the night before. "Julian," Sterling said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "you look tired. I assume the audit was as grueling as the numbers suggest." "Justice," Julian said, his voice instantly smoothing into a honeyed, high-status purr. "A pleasure. Yes, we've been working around the clock. My team and my assistant, Elias here, have prepared a comprehensive briefing that clears every hurdle." Julian gestured to me with a dismissive flick of his hand, the way one might point out a functioning radiator.
Elias, if you'd be so kind as to hand the justice the summary of the offshore liquidities, the ones we discussed." I didn't move. The silence that followed was heavy, technical, and absolute. It was the kind of silence preceding a controlled demolition. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Julian," Justice Sterling said, not looking up from the file. "The court doesn't require your permission to vet an officer of the law, Marcus, especially when that officer has been embedded in your firm for 6 months, documenting what appears to be a systematic, multi-layered scheme of fiduciary negligence and capital flight." Julian's face didn't just go pale, it went gray. The transition was clinical. The arrogance he'd worn like a suit of armor for decades simply evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked suddenly, violently old. He turned his head toward me, a slow, mechanical movement. "Elias?" he whispered. The word wasn't a question, it was a realization. "For the record, I am and have never been an employee of Sterling Vane. I was appointed by the Federal District Court as an independent monitor under the Sarbanes-Oxley oversight provisions. Every hour I spent working for you was a court-sanctioned investigation. Every free audit I performed was an evidentiary collection." I opened my folio, the same one Julian had flicked toward the floor the night before, and slid a single document across the table. "This is the Midtown Convergence Debt Restructuring Plan, or more accurately, it's the paper trail for the $212 million Marcus borrowed from the construction escrow to cover his losses in the Singapore short squeeze last year. You thought you were using me as free labor to hide the bodies. In reality, you were handing me the shovels and showing me exactly where you'd buried them." The physical collapse of the room was fascinating to observe. Marcus's hands dropped to his sides, his tablet clattering onto the table. Julian's jaw tightened so hard I could hear the click of bone. He looked like a man who had been told the gravity he'd relied on his whole life had suddenly decided to work in the opposite direction. You signed a non-disclosure agreement," Julian hissed, his predatory instincts trying to find one last clawhold. "The fellowship contract was a masterpiece of legal theater," I interrupted. "It was drafted by the Justice Department's Oversight Division. Clause 14B specifically notes that any attempt to use the fellow for the purpose of concealing criminal liability nullifies the entire agreement and triggers an automatic referral to the SEC. You didn't read it, Julian. You were too busy making sure the coffee was hot and your car was at the south entrance." Justice Sterling tapped his pen on the table, a sound like a gavel. "The logistics of this are simple, gentlemen," the judge said. "As of 9 a.m., the Midtown Convergence Project is under federal receivership. Sterling Vane is no longer the lead counsel. In fact, based on the Special Master's report, Sterling Vane is currently being audited for insolvency. Elias has documented that your firm has been operating on a Ponzi structure of debt shifting for the better part of 3 years." "That's impossible," Marcus stammered. "We have assets. We have the portfolio." "You have ghosts. You have high-end sandalwood and ionized air. But the actual capital, the liquidity that was supposed to back this merger, it's gone. You spent it on appearances. You spent it on the illusion of being too big to fail. But the thing about illusions is that they require an audience that believes in them. And right now, no one is watching." Julian looked at me then, his eyes burning with a localized, intense hatred. "You ruined us. For what? A seat at this table? You think Sterling is going to give you a job after you betrayed the men who took you in?" I smiled. It was the first time I'd smiled in 6 months. It wasn't warm. "I don't want a seat at your table, Julian. I'm here to take the table apart." I turned to Justice Sterling. "Justice, if we can proceed to the asset freeze and the immediate termination of the senior partnership's access to the servers, I believe the FBI is already in the lobby of the 42nd floor." Julian's phone began to vibrate on the table, then Marcus's, then the associates, a digital chorus of the end. The tide hadn't just turned, it had gone out, leaving them standing in the mud, exposed and entirely alone. The 42nd floor was no longer a temple of curated silence. It was a crime scene. The ionized air now carried the sharp, metallic tang of panic and the frantic scuffle of federal agents, boxed in by mid-century modern furniture. Blue windbreakers with yellow FBI block letters moved through the glass corridors like a foreign antibody attacking a virus. It was a beautiful, clinical disinfection. I stood in the center of the atrium, the same spot where, 24 hours ago, Marcus had told me I was cluttering the aesthetic. Now he was the clutter. I watched 2 agents escort him toward the freight elevator, the service entrance he'd always insisted I use. He didn't look like a crown prince anymore. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his Windsor knot was just a very expensive noose. I turned my attention to the bullpen. 50 junior associates and paralegals stood by their desks, frozen, watching the icons on their computer screens turn to gray as the servers were locked down. They were the ones who actually kept the lights on. They were the ones who, like me, had stayed until 3 a.m. while Julian and Marcus were out at the Polo Bar, charging $3,000 dinners to client development funds that didn't exist. "May I have your attention?" I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The vacuum of power in the room was so absolute that even a whisper would have carried. "As of 30 minutes ago, Sterling and Vane is in liquidation," I said, walking slowly through the rows of desks. "The senior partners are currently being processed for federal indictment, but this firm is more than its predatory name. It is its data. It is its labor." I stopped at the desk of Sarah, a third-year associate who had written 90% of the convergence brief, only to have Julian strip her name from the filing. Her eyes were wide, vibrating with the fear of a lost career. As continued, the court has authorized a meritocratic restructuring. Every associate who contributed to the investigative audit will be retained under the new receivership. The bonuses that Julian and Marcus deferred into their offshore accounts for the last 3 years, those funds have been frozen and are being reallocated as back pay. You are not losing your jobs. You are finally being paid for the ones you actually do. A ripple went through the room. Not a cheer, but a collective exhale. The sound of 50 anchors finally hitting the seabed. Go home. Spend time with your families. Come back on Monday. The name on the door will be different, but for the first time in this building's history, the math will be honest. I walked toward the corner office, the inner sanctum. Julian Thorne was sitting behind his mahogany desk. He wasn't packing. He was just sitting there, staring at a glass of scotch that cost more than a month of my stipend. The room felt smaller now, the shadows of the late afternoon sun stretching across the floor like bars. "You could have made me a king, Elias," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't look at me. "You had the mind for it, the coldness. You could have been the successor I never had. Instead, you chose to be a janitor." I walked over to the window. The city was still there, indifferent to the collapse of one more ego. "That's your fundamental flaw, Julian," I said, my voice like a scalpel. "You think status is something you grant. You think you take people in and make them. You never realized that the only reason this floor stayed level was because I was holding it up. I wasn't your successor. I was your scaffolding. And when you treat your foundations like trash, the building eventually remembers how much it hates the sky." "You're a parasite, Julian," spat Julian, finally turning to face me. "You lived on our prestige. You used our letterhead to get into the rooms you've always envied. You're just another vulture picking at the bones of a better man's work." I let that hang in the air for a moment. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver thumb drive, the master key to the firm's shadow ledger. Prestige is a narrative, Julian. It's a story we tell to justify the fact that some people have the money and others have the brains. But eventually the story ends, and when the ink dries, all that's left is the balance sheet. I leaned over the desk, invading the space he'd guarded so fiercely. You aren't a better man whose work is being picked over. You're a man who hasn't read a contract in a decade. You're a man who thought he could outsource his intelligence for free and not pay the interest on the debt. I didn't ruin you. I just stopped pretending you were competent. I straightened my jacket. The door behind me opened. 2 federal marshals stood waiting. "They're ready for you, Julian. Oh, and about the car, the one you wanted at the south entrance?" I looked at my watch. "It's a black sedan. It has a cage in the back. I'd suggest you process that sequence correctly." Julian didn't move for a long time. Then, with a slow, trembling hand, he reached for his glass, but his fingers slipped. The liquid spilled across the mahogany, a dark amber stain spreading toward the edge. He looked down at it, watching the liquid drip on his handmade Italian shoes. He looked small. He looked irrelevant. I walked out of the office and through the bullpen one last time. The agents were boxing up the files, the physical remains of a decade of greed. As I stood by the elevator, waiting for the doors to open, I realized the pressure in my chest, the weight I'd been carrying since the day I first walked into this toxic mausoleum, was gone. People think status is about the height of the floor you stand on or the weight of the watch on your wrist. They're wrong. True status isn't the ability to use people. It's the ability to be the only person in the room who knows how the room actually works. It's the quiet, terrifying power of being indispensable to people who are too arrogant to notice they're drowning. The elevator chimed. I stepped inside and pressed G. I didn't look at the reflection in the polished brass doors. I didn't need to. I knew exactly who I was. I was the man who had been used for free labor right up until the moment I became the only one with the keys to the kingdom. The doors closed, and for the first time in 6 months, I let the silence be mine.